Hi, everybody. Welcome to another conversation here on Esoterica, where I'm again really uh, I have a lot of gratitude to be joined by folks who are both scholars and practitioners in their respective fields. And so I'm really excited to be joined by Marco Visconti and Thorn Mooney to have a conversation about a culture. Sort of where is the culture of the occult, very broadly speaking? And I'm interested in this question mostly because I'm outside of it. And so this is why I've invited a couple of folks who have a lot more expertise than I do to give some commentary about sort of where a culture is. Marco, I invited you primarily coming
Yeah.
in from the world of Thelema and the world of maybe ceremonial magic a little bit, and Thorn. You have a great insight into the world of contemporary witchcraft and that world. And as much as those worlds are part of a culture, they don't talk to each other a lot, or at least they don't talk to each other in pleasantries in many cases. But I'm really pleased to be joined by you both. Thank you for taking the time to enlighten me and also to to have a chat here on Esoterica.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Wonderful. Marco and Thorn, would you guys mind introducing yourself before we sort of get the larger frame and get the conversation going?
Not at
Thorn,
all.
would you start? Would you start?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everybody. My name is Thorn Mooney. I'm a PhD student in religious studies. I am an author. I have several books out with Llewellyn. My most recent is actually a blend of my practitioner and scholarly perspectives. It's a survey text, actually, of contemporary witchcraft communities really broadly, and it's called Witches Among Us, Understanding Contemporary Witchcraft and Wicca. I've been running my mouth on the internet for a really long time, and you can find me most frequently these days on YouTube just by searching Thorn Mooney. I'll come right up.
And my name is Marco Visconti. My first book, which is titled The Aleister Crowley Manual to Thelemic Magic for Modern Times, was released almost 2 years ago to the date now. Time flies, from Watkins Publishing. And my second book, which will be again out from Watkins Publishing, will be out at the end of the year, November, I think. If we were going to be still there by November, hopefully, fingers crossed. And it's going to be titled Aleister Crowley's Mysticism: A Practical Guide, and it's going to be like the second part of my discussion on thelema and thelemic practices and what to do in practice, right, as opposed to just always talking about it. I've been running my mouth on the internet for a long time as well, and it got me in trouble multiple times. So I'm pretty sure that's going to happen after this video as well. So thank you, Justin, for having me.
Don't worry, I'll tell you if you're wrong, Marco.
Thank you. I expect that.
Well, thank you guys both for coming on, and I'll have links in the description and in the comments below, folks, where you can find Thorn and Marco's books and links to their content and all the other things they're doing online. So one of the things I think most folks noticed there was a pretty substantial uptick, and you can see this in the Google Trends during the pandemic, especially in interest, a generalized interest, specifically in North America and Europe, it seems, on topics in the occult, on topics in ceremonial magic, and in topics on witchcraft. I would think that witchcraft saw the largest spike in many of those, and now with the days of the sort of COVID-19 pandemic well behind us, almost a lifetime behind us, it seems like in some ways, it's clear that a culture has transformed. The aftermath of what that spike during the pandemic has transformed a culture, it seems to me, and I see it to some degrees through a sort of a strange lens on esoterica. And I'm curious about sort of where we are now from your perspectives and where you think trends are pointing us in the coming years. And of course, we've had a very important election here in the United States that will obviously also contribute to that as well. But I guess the first opening question is, what were some of the features that you noticed that were defining of the COVID-19 era of a culture?
You want to kick it off, Marco?
I'll start with that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think that what happened there is that it was kind of like a perfect storm, right? Not just, the pandemic was, of course, the moment where everybody was sitting at home. They had a lot of time to fill, and maybe it was a time where maybe also, as a way to ward off all the negative and actually the fears that we were all experiencing at the time. I mean, maybe a lot of people will have forgotten by now, but for a while we didn't know if this thing would kill us, right? It was quite intense, and so maybe people started using the extra time they had to explore maybe topics that they always wanted to explore, but also trying to find solace in practices that maybe help them to make sense of possibly their own mortality, right? But when I say that, in my opinion, there was a perfect storm, because I think that this started even earlier, because in my experience, when I was looking at the culture as a whole, like I've always been involved with it, but around already 2016, things started to change, in the sense that more people were starting using social media. And so things like Tumblr witches started to happen, and there was a lot of discourse from younger people into that. The Me Too movement came along, and not only changed the landscape of society as we know, but also people were finding witchcraft and the occult as a way to empower themselves and empower their beliefs, and to like strong of this the ability of being more open about who they were and what they were into. And then I also think that there was another thing that really, for me, was kind of like like a divide. I don't know if you remember, in the 20th of April 2020, so in the first month into the pandemic already, Netflix released something called The Midnight Gospel. And so the Midnight Gospel was Duncan Trussell, which is a famous podcaster, doing his own almost like it was a podcast on Netflix with all very nicely done cartoons. And there were two guests there. One was Damien Eccles, and another is another known character. And they were actually speaking about magic and speaking about ceremonial magic and how to use magic to make sense of the world around them. Well, the titles were interesting, because the title with Damien Eccles was Hunters Without a Home, and the title with the other person was the Annihilation of Joy, which kind of was what we were feeling at the time, right? I think that that was the uptick for me. Like I remember that I was starting, I put together a Patreon a year before in 2019, because I was starting, at the time I left the Ordo Templi Orientis, and I wanted to see if there were people interested in learning magic online. And it didn't really work, right? Because there was some people were interested, but not so much. From that point onward, that was almost like the floodgates were open and everybody was interested in that. So that was my experience. What about you, Thorn? What do you say?
I agree with you that I think that there were some things going on prior to the pandemic hitting. One of the things in witchcraft that I think is really significant, first of all, there's a narrative that makes me uncomfortable sometimes, but I think it's worth bringing up. There's this narrative that, well, people turn to witchcraft and magic when suffering is at a high. And I think that there's some elements of truth to that, but it doesn't explain every spurt that we see. I feel like that's one of those easy kind of anthropological explanations that we've been relying on throughout the 20th century. Oh, people do magic when they're sad. And that's certainly true. But that's not the only thing that's going on. To me, one of the things that I was paying attention to, because I'm always paying attention to this, because I'm in religious studies, is how collectively, especially in the US, but I'm comfortable extending this to Europe as well. I think that the increased kind of individualism that we see in people's kind of broad sense of religiosity was really significant. And I want to put some scare quotes here, because I know that I'm already going to get some comments here. This is not me saying that witchcraft is absolutely a religion, or that you have to think of it as a religion. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that there are trends in the wider religious landscape that impact how people think about witchcraft. And one of those trends is this emphasis on individuality. So, for example, in witchcraft, we know historically that things like New Thought and spiritualism have impact on all kinds of contemporary witchcraft, right? We tend to think that it's just Wicca, but it's really all of them. And we saw the rise of manifestation, right? And the idea of manifestation has been around for a long time, but it really entered witchcraft in a really big way. I think right around, really before the pandemic, this idea that you can take control of your life somehow by controlling your thoughts. And that lends itself to an exploration of, I think, personal power. So suddenly you don't necessarily have to be an initiate in a coven or even practicing spells or invested in feminist discourse, etc., to be a witch, right? The concept of witch expanded really dramatically at this time. And then the pandemic hits and we were even more online than we were. So there's a lot going on, but I do think that if we consider those broader trends in the religious landscape, we'll get some more answers.
Okay.
That's very helpful. Yeah, I think again, it's easy to sort of zoom into the pandemic and go straight to that line where you see it pop up in Google searches and assume that occurs in isolation. And of course, nothing in society, religious studies occurs in isolation. Did you notice the disintegration of organizations or the disintegrations of groupings? And I'm using groupings in a loose sense, not just in the sense of organizations, but groupings coming into the pandemic that didn't make it. And what kind of groupings did you notice coming out that perhaps were formed in the fires of Mount Doom, or the fires of COVID? How did the groupings in your experience come in and then come out?
Well, I mean, in my experience, right, I was being very critical of what I call or hierarchical orders, hierarchical structure already, because that was my negative experience with OTO, with Ordo Templarientis. So I saw that happening in the sense that, as the pandemic unfolded, and even the first 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and then 1 year, start to roll in, all these groups completely dropped the ball. Of course, instead of trying to, so of course you could not meet in person, but instead of doing what I was doing, when it was Thorn was doing, what many other occult authors were doing, get a YouTube channel up and running, get a Patreon. All this organization did nothing at all. I still keep tabs on the OTO. I still have friends in it, and they were like, "Yeah, no, we're not doing anything, right?" So in many ways, a complete vacuum formed, where for the longest time, instead, everybody who had interest in these topics would flock to this or that organization, because, believe it or not, I mean, branding is still fundamental and important, even in Esoterica, right? In the sense that if you want to be a Thelemite, the first thing you hear about is the Ordo Templarientis. Maybe the second is the AA, but it's all about if I belong to this school, then I'm real, right? And so there was as all this organization dropped the ball and banally did not organize YouTube live streams or things like that. People like me, but also others, were almost came into the void and started offering an alternative. In my experience, though, as the pandemic ended and where we are nowadays, it's almost kind of like everybody flocked back to those realities, partly because out of a craving for in-person, direct, real experiences, as opposed to something that's virtual and mediated, like we are here right now, on YouTube, but also because the power of the brand is still important, and that, I think, that is a problem, if you ask me, because it kind of taught me that people are really not, most people, not all of them, most people are just not interested in spirituality per se, but they need to belong to the right group, to the one so they can actually wear the hoodie with the OTO lamen on that, which is a thing. At least that has been my experience.
Yeah, and I think that that's intertwined really closely to that individualism I was talking about, because if organizations have to brand, now individually we have to brand as well, right? Thorn Mooney isn't just a scholar or a thinker or a witch or a high priestess. She's a brand. And that gets messy really fast. And I think in a lot of ways that's unavoidable in the kind of economic climate that we're in right now. I don't think that the pandemic, I see it becoming just a bigger, stronger thing. And as social media, and I'm sure we'll get to this, as social media kind of takes a different sort of nosedive recently. I'm hopeful that we will see more folks grappling with what that means. For my own practice, my own experience as a practitioner, I will say that in Gardnerian circles and in other initiatory witchcraft circles, what we saw were folks during the pandemic trying to negotiate, well, how do we do a mystery tradition virtually? Is that possible? Can we have an outer court using Discord? Can we do ritual? And, people had been trying to do various kinds of magical ritual mediated by the internet for a long time, since there's been an internet, but the necessity that the pandemic placed on things, I think, really just kicked that into gear. And as awful as things were, that was actually really exciting to see.
Yeah.
And the jury is out for me. I was as uncomfortable as anybody else, right? My coven didn't have internet rituals. Okay, we stopped circling for a while and we had to figure things out, and then we were outside and things were messy. But I watched other group leaders explore and experiment, and it was really exciting and cool to see all the cool things that they came up with. And I'm seeing people retain those ideas and have broader ideas about what it means to be in community. And you'll discover this if you read my work or you hang out with me on the internet. I'm very ambivalent about the internet. I love it. I hate it. So, this is kind of my silver lining perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad one to have, though, right? Because
No, it's interesting that you guys talk about this idea of negotiating digital landscapes, because this was a huge issue in Judaism, because Judaism specifically forbids the use of technology on Shabbat. And so this
Okay.
was a huge issue. And so one of the answers that emerged was, if we turn it on before Shabbat comes in on Friday and just leave the live stream running for 26 hours, no one's broken any rules. And again, to Thorn's point, the way that you learned what hoops to jump through and to make the hoops and jump through them, there are these comedic acts of genius, and I really appreciate the creativity that can emerge. I guess another question, maybe just an adjunct to this, is that coming from a more ceremonial space where it seems like you need people in a space, and that's one end of a spectrum, and the other end of a spectrum is being solitary practitioners. Is it the case that you saw a shift toward solitary practice in your respective communities? I imagine that, it seems like it's relatively impossible to do a Gnostic mass by yourself, but or calling a circle. But it seems like these are kinds of things that one can't do for just sheerly technical reasons. But was there a shift in interest in specifically solitary practice? And it seems to me that witchcraft is a bit more adaptable, and not Gardnerian and Alexandrian witchcraft, but other forms of witchcraft are a bit more adaptable in that respect. But was there a shift in that in those directions specifically?
Yeah. I think in witchcraft communities, the solitary has always been where most of the weight goes. And I think generally speaking, people were fine. I will say that one of my personal soapboxes as a BTW practitioner is that everybody should learn how to do their shit by themselves. If you can't do witchcraft without your coven, then you need some help. So like those, but it's a different sort of practice. And like I said, it was interesting kind of watching people negotiate, what do things look like? And what I've often said in the course of my career running my mouth on the internet is that if the choice is between doing the magic weird or not ideally, or maybe kind of wrong, or being confused about it or ambivalent about it, and not doing it at all, I'm going to do it weird. I think witchcraft, if nothing else, is pretty ruthlessly pragmatic. Even the traditions that have the reputation for being more ceremonial and more strict, right? Guards and Lexies. We saw a lot of creativity. I think folks who maybe they had a coven practice, but they didn't have much of a solitary practice, started to develop one. That was really cool. I think the dynamics of individual groups shifted. So I don't know that I would say that things shifted in maybe a permanent way, or even a particularly noticeable one, but necessity breeds invention, and I think we
Yeah.
were pretty inventive.
Yeah, and I mean, this is exactly what happened to me in my with my group in my like wider community, right? Like you said, like you cannot do a Gnostic mass, on Zoom at all, right? But that is when, for instance, I brought in the idea. Okay, well, how about all of you that always said that you wanted to explore what it means to conjure a spirit, right? Okay, let's do this together. Let's put a calendar. Let's take a grimoire. Let's take the Arbatel. And so we did the Arbatel over 14 months. So because it's like we would actually gather on Zoom and like maybe read the aphorisms, and then okay, how do we construct the various tools that are needed? Do we need tools? Well, on this group, it was more like creating a practice together, and then each person would go and do the practice, and then we come back on Zoom, and pretty much like use Zoom as a magical diary. I still have on my website like something like hundreds, 300 400 hours of live Zoom recordings of people like pretty much like experience, like talking about what they experience as conjuring Fool or conjuring Aratron, etc., etc., etc. To be fair, for me, that was more magic that I've ever done and seen other people do in all my years in OTO, by far, because like I said, like not only we had a lot of time, and I think a lot of my students are in the United States, like you guys are, and a lot of them were able to use all the sort of like incentives that you guys were getting. Of course, we didn't get any in the UK. So the thing is that like it was a way to maybe even use whatever little money that was coming from the government to invest in spiritual evolution, right? And it was like about learning how to. Some people literally learn how to forge a sword. Like it was quite incredible to see, right? Because it was like that was the time where they finally could do it, possibly because they didn't need to go to Gnostic mass, which was because most people go to Gnostic mass, that's it. That, at least that is my experience in almost a decade in the OTL here in London. I want to be very clear. I know that different people have different experiences of what the OTL is. My experience here was people showing up once a month, and we might maybe never see them again, because that was like it's going to mass. And is that magic? I don't know. Maybe like as Thorn was doing, like doing something messy, but doing it's so much better than just going by rota, just because this is what everybody does.
And that speaks to a larger conversation about magic and occultism generally that I know isn't necessarily the focal point of this particular conversation, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. I love thinking about this idea. I was talking about wider trends in the religious landscape, and I think it's interesting that we still have this idea of, I'm going to call them like professionalized religious practitioners. So like there's a difference between maybe somebody who just goes to the Gnostic mass and doesn't do anything else, somebody who goes to their coven meeting and doesn't do anything else. We would joke, maybe you grew up with jokes about like Sunday Christians. There's this idea in magical spaces that if you're going to be an occultist, if you're going to be a magician, if you're going to be a witch, if you're going to be whatever, then it has to be like all consuming. And there's not a lot of room for, I'm not necessarily saying I advocate this, but it's a reality. There's not a lot of room for the casual consumption of magic. And that was something that I think the pandemic did, and maybe why we saw so much of it. Like suddenly there's an end cap at Target with witchcraft stuff, right? And the assumption is not that you're going to actually pursue like spiritual ascension or high priesthood or something, but maybe you can learn how to change your thinking to improve your life or something. The pandemic, and I think people sharing on social media and maybe the novelty of how people were approaching magic made it easier to be casual.
That's an interesting point, and I think a lot of that sort of you have to be hardcore or not is often the result of it's sort of the zeal of the proselyte that almost no one's born into an esoteric tradition, or very few people, and therefore they convert over. Often they convert over in a form of displaced fundamentalism. They come from one fundamentalism, and they displace that fundamentalism with another one, and they take on the same zeal, and now they're snapping their wrists with a rubber band or whatever.
Totally.
So
I think
so
some of
it's
it
sort of
is
that proselytites the proselytization kind of side of things. But I do like the idea that we have them too, right? Yom Kippur, high holiday Jews. I'm like, yeah, like
mm,
that's a legitimate form of being religious. In fact,
yeah.
I trust that form of being religious way more than I trust someone who's there 3 times a day every day. Those people worry me. And so it's be hardcore, but don't be that.
Well, I
Like,
think some of it is
Not too much.
yeah,
some of
yeah,
it is capitalism too, right? Like
Mhm.
some of it is we have to monetize our hobbies and our interests. If you're
yeah,
going to be this happens in witchcraft, absolutely. We have this idea that the mark of an advanced practitioner is monetizing it somehow. You have to either write a book or you have to start giving workshops, you have to teach classes, you have to become a reader, you have like that is the mark of adepthood somehow is producing a product. And again, I'm not saying that this is like people got to do what they see. I've done all this stuff too. I don't mean it as a critique, but it's something worth thinking about and interrogating. Why is that the mark of mastery?
right. Yeah, to become a commodity should not be the destiny of religion.
It's interesting you mentioned this point because then again, what I notice is that there's been during the pandemic, and as the pandemic was ending and has the zenith of this interest start to wane, then there were a lot of criticism towards people. Even people were writing books, right? Or I mean, I famously, that's how I make my living. I write books. I teach courses online. I mean, before the pandemic, I had a different job. The pandemic, wiped away my previous job, and then here I am, almost 6 years later, which is crazy to think about. But what's interesting because during the pandemic, it was somehow acceptable, even encouraged, to the point that I think the pendulum swung too much in the direction, as you were saying, that then everybody was a writer. I'm not going to name names because I'm on best behavior, but I remember people popping up like fungi and then writing 2 books and then we were gone in a season. Like I don't like this was even before AI, so maybe, I don't know how they did it, but they did it, right? But it was okay for a while because everybody not maybe like everybody was maybe on their best behavior. Everybody was accepting of the extreme circumstances, and everybody needed to be entertained. So this constant barrage of new material coming out, and maybe new things you could buy, because again, sadly, we live in a late stage capitalism that is draining us all. But that's the world we live in. So it was okay. And then as the pandemic waned, the harsh criticism came in.
Mm.
And I'm not just talking about, you're the classic thing is that you're a grifter. You're a grifter. You're grifting. What are you grifting? Because you write a book. I've seen this. I mean, this has been leveraged towards me. This has been leveraged towards Lon Mayo Duquette. This has been leveraged towards people who've been doing this for 20 years. No, it's all about people wanting to make money. I mean, I think I can speak for everybody. There's not much money to be made in this scene, right? Maybe you can make a decent living. I'm lucky to do so. I don't know, Thorn. Maybe it's the same for you.
What do you
But
mean? I'm independently wealthy from my publishing career. The only thing that pays me more is being an academic.
exactly. Right. But
Well,
I mean,
Those are
dire
jokes.
straits.
Those
You
are
should,
jokes.
I think say you should open a GoFundMe if that's true.
yeah,
Um, y-
So yeah, I
uh,
mean, like what I was saying, like I noticed, like this thing on one side, yes, everything was being monetized, and it became like the mark of an adepthood. But then, as those people disappear, because of course, how many videos can you make on the on Telema, on the basics of Telema 101? Again, not naming names, but there are plenty of famous occult influencers that have done the same video 15 times now. And on the other side, there were people that came back almost with a vengeance to say, everybody that did this is a grifter. Everybody that even remotely like paying their bills with the books they wrote or their course they teach, it's bad. This is what I think it's problematic in this post-pandemic landscape, because we had a moment where it was almost acceptable to be a professional occultist, and now it's like the stigma is back.
and so maybe this
Wait a minute.
gets to the second the next question I'd want to ask both of you is that sometimes quantity can become quality. That's a weird thing that can happen. That if you get enough of something, then there's a qualitative shift. And this sounds like something like that. That there's a moment where the quantity of something had a qualitative shift. And I'm wondering if you can see other examples of that. maybe another way of asking the same question is a lot more academics, and I'm putting myself here on blast. A lot of academics have entered into the space of occulture, and I wonder if us being in the mesh has had a qualitative impact, and I mean that both in positive and negative ways, because I think that it is probably both, because everything is probably both. But I'm curious about this quantity quality transfer, where a huge uptick in quantity probably cash itself out in terms of quality. And I'm wondering if there's any especially salient examples of that. A huge amount of books may have led to a sort of anti-book backlash or an anti-intellectual backlash. One of the things I get accused of from time to time is being an armchair occultist, and I'm like, the the for the noun to be true, for the adjective to be true, the noun has to be true. I'm like, I'm not an armchair anything. I'm like, I don't, doesn't apply to me at all. It's a category error. But this idea that like you're not doing it, there's sort of oh, you're just an intellectual, you're just an academic. And I'm like, I might be just an academic. And I'm curious about those kind of quality, quantity transfers. If you've noticed something like that occurring in your respective milieux.
Oof. I'm going to say something horrible. It's not. I'm going to tell you about myself for a second, because maybe that's a place to start. My personal bent, like as a practitioner, since I was in my young 20s, was very intellectual. I think that's a hurdle in witchcraft broadly that we talk about. I've written about it. Certainly, this idea of like, okay, you've read a whole lot of books, now go do something. I get it. And as I got older and I had jobs and I went to grad school and I had different jobs and I had worse jobs. And I mean, I graduated during the Great Recession, right? Like life was weird. And then there was a pandemic and blah, 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 unprecedented times. I hit a point in my academic life where I no longer cared if I was marketable. I decided that I was going to study what I wanted to study. And if that meant that I couldn't get a job, I was just okay with it, because guess what? I never got the job. I graduated during the Great Recession. So I figured out, as a way of grappling with my own mortality during the pandemic, that if we're all going to die anyway, I'm going to run my mouth about magic and the occult and witchcraft, and I'm going to do it with letters after my name. If some university is going to pay me to get a PhD, I'm going to do it. And if I have to work retail at the end of it anyway, you know what? It wouldn't be the first time. And if that was my experience, I would imagine that that was other people's experiences too. I think that the influx of academics talking about these topics, first of all, if more people do it, it's marketable, right? The academy is a marketplace like anything else. But I also think that it speaks to a decline in the structures kind of scaffolding the traditional nature of academia. Right? If people can get on the internet and make money on YouTube or whatever, talking about these ideas that 15 years ago we thought, oh, that nobody's going to care about that. That's not traditional enough. Or now we've proved that that's not the case. I mean, I haven't even finished my PhD, and I'm getting like offers to do things as a scholar because it turns out that actually it is marketable.
Yeah.
So lots of mixed feelings, but I think it's not just the religious landscape that's changed or social media that's changed. It's also the academy.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, right, like I got my degree 25 years ago, and I never pursued, a PhD because, I ran away with the circus as a musician, as I like to say, and that was my life for 15 years, right? But then when I came back, when that life ended, and we're talking about around 10 years ago, and I start getting heavily involved in Esoterica once again, culture, especially as a member of the OTO, I started to realize what Thorn just said, that there was an influx of academics into this field, which meant exactly that it was becoming marketable. Things, the ivory tower was opening its gates more or less a little bit, and it was great. I'll tell you, like, for instance, the OTO itself invested a lot into getting people in academia. And there are a lot of high-ranking members of the OTO who are academics across, United States, Canada, and Europe. And for the longest time, I thought that's great. That's fantastic, right? And then I started noticing something again, like I would say maybe in the last year or so. When the bubble has burst, and we're finally coming back to somehow more of a normality of what this landscape is going to be in the years to come. And what I noticed is that if you don't have those letters behind your name, you're not taken it as much as in consideration as someone else. And oftentimes, when it comes to dilemma, for instance, I cannot speak for other traditions, but when it comes to dilemma, uh, not all of those who have letters behind their name have the best information, or maybe their information is heavily biased because they belong to an organization that has a specific message to sell. And that's I think that's problematic, right? Because maybe the easiest way for people like me would be, hey, like, you gotta suck it up, go back and get a PhD, and maybe I will, right? Because maybe that is what you need to do to have a relevant voice. But it's definitely true that if we have one side that on one side we have this ability of, look at your channel, Justin. I mean, you have almost 1 million subscribers. That's fantastic. That would have been impossible 5 years ago. 10 years ago was a dream, right? And I think it's that because you are an academic, you are very good at presenting a coherent, a logical argument, and you're knowledgeable because you studied these subjects in detail. So you have a broad spectrum. But then, what about anybody that wants to speak about a specific subject that doesn't have that ability? Because even being an academic, I think you need to have some certain mindset. Like, you need to be scholarly. So are we going to just cut out all the non-scholarly voices because they're not marketable enough? Again, it's a question that I have. I think the net is positive. I think we are in a net positive. It's great that the academia is so involved in Esoterica at the moment. Let's see where we're going next, though.
It's an interesting irony that the value of a PhD in academia has plummeted, but the value of a PhD in Esoterica has greatly increased.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's worth just reminding folks too that I think like all of those things are true. And anytime we're talking about weighing a degree versus not a degree, we're always talking about equity, right? Excluding people who don't have degrees means we're excluding a lot of women, right? We're excluding it ends up giving the microphone back primarily to white men.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that will change, but that's just the reality right now. If I limit myself to, I mean, I make jokes too about like the Beanie Baby occult books, right? It's dudes. And it's true in academic spaces too.
Sure,
so
absolutely.
we have to throw that in there too.
I totally agree. And also, this has been a thing that I decided pretty early on in the channel, was that I was not going to just host academics. I really wanted to bring in practitioner voices, scholar practitioner voices, people with no degrees whatsoever who I think are like taking the material very seriously, both ritualistically, as far as I can tell, and I can judge, which I try to be careful about that. But yeah, the voices I want to surround myself with are not, because I think academics are often not the best, especially when it comes to talking about the practice of a religion. I don't know what the hell they're talking about. I'll give one example of this that just came out recently. In academia, we're told that there are no more Shabbatians in the world. That Shabbatite, the worship of Shabbatites V in Turkey went extinct in the 1950s. There are no more Donme. A person just reached out for me in Turkey who was like, my family's Donme. We exist. I'm making a documentary about us. I'm like, stupid academics.
Oh yeah, academics say wrong stuff about contemporary witchcraft all the time.
So embarrassing.
Constantly.
Oh, it's like so embarrassing. So at any rate, again, I think that, and this is a thing I agree with, organization like RINSEP, is that I don't think there's going to be a future of a culture unless academics and practitioners are able to sit across the table with a deep amount of respect, and a deep respect for difference, and be able to say we're doing very different things, and here's where overlap happens, and here's where we can grow in that overlap and better each other and inform each other, because I have much more to learn, I think, than practitioners have to learn in many ways. from me. I don't think that me telling them that there are 150 manuscripts of the Key of Solomon is going to change whether or not they are effective at raising spirits. So
It's interesting
it-
to know, though. so
it's just, yeah, it's
So,
an
yeah.
interesting fact, and like it means that there's like a synoptic problem like Christians have with the New
Well,
Testament, or
I
but
think it's more than a fact, because you remember that for most practitioners, since you're speaking about the Goetia, for instance, like they still think that the Matters tradition is the only thing that there is, and then they discover, wait a second, actually there is even that is it the best text that we can use? Maybe
Right.
not, right?
Yeah, it's
So
just, and again, for me, it's about accessibility. I'm not there to present this fact as a barrier. I'm there to present it as a way of saying, oh, this is a thing I should empower myself by learning more about. So, I guess to shift back, to think about sort of these groupings that have emerged. Um, there was this huge push toward the digital world, in which that was born out of necessity, and now we're back into a world in which a non-digital existence is possible. I know that's very difficult to believe for those of us who make our living on the internet, but there is a non-digital world, and I'm wondering how post-pandemic non-digital um, groupings look like in your respective experiences. Or do they look different than pre-pandemic? Or how they look different, or in what ways do they look different?
That's a good question. I don't think, in my experience, I don't think they look radically different. The only difference I see is that, I mean, it's a banal difference in the sense that people now know that they can also, they will not be resistant to watch a YouTube lecture or things like that. Before, in my ward in Telema, people would just know, like, what is the internet? Like, why do you want to do like a Skype call? Remember Skype, when we had Skype? What do you mean that I should maybe even pay to learn online? But it's definitely true that people crave in person now. Like, it's in my experience, at least, it's so much easier to organize and get attendance to a workshop. I did a workshop on the Todd Tarot 2 days ago at the College of Psychic Studies here in London. It was a great success. A lot of people there. In like 6 hours of me talking, it's a nightmare, but people were there, loved it, and I loved it, and it was very alive, right? Which is not something I can get as easily anymore when I still do my monthly now. They used to be weekly, now they're monthly, of course, like they slow down, lectures online. I still do them, and there's still a good number of people, 50, 60, but there used to be 200 people there, right? So it's like, you can see, like, there's been a huge dissipation, if you want, of online attention, and people crave the in-person once again. I cannot really tell you what it's like in my ex family, the OTO, because I haven't been there forever, nor I will ever go back. I hear voices, it's like words on the grapevine, and things aren't great, because it seems to me that, at least here in London, at least here in the UK, I don't know what's the rest of the world, they are still lagging behind badly, without offering anything else. So that's my experience.
I think in Witchcraft, part of the thing at stake was that it's also generational, because we saw, and I think you can see this just scrolling around hashtags on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, the folks who adapted most readily to the digital scene were younger folks, and a lot of those folks were already being pretty actively ostracized by I think the kind of more established like in-person kind of structures. I can't speak to other sorts of magical communities, but I think that ageism is still very much a thing in witchcraft communities. There's definitely this idea that, like, when young people do it, it's somehow less serious, and if young people are on the internet, then that somehow is a problem. So there was definitely this attitude that, like, I think we saw panic from some of the older, more established communities who weren't sure how to negotiate the pandemic. And then when the pandemic ended, and so far as it ended, there was this relief to go back to things the way they were. And I think I agree with Marco in that sense. I don't see really drastic differences. The festivals are still happening. They feel the same as they were pre-pandemic. Where I see the starkest changes are with younger folks who maybe they discovered witchcraft online, and now there are more in-person opportunities, so they're venturing out into those communities for the first time. And that's very exciting to watch those folks negotiate those spaces. So I think introducing that generational distinction, I think maybe tells us some additional narrative too.
It's interesting you mentioning younger folks going into real spaces, because I don't see this happening here in the UK at all. Like here in the UK, age, like everybody is older than me. I'm still seen as a younger guy. I'm 46 this year, right? No,
Oh,
young.
I think you're old.
Thank you. Please reel it in. I like that. I'm old. I am. But when the average at a Glastonbury conference is 60, then I'm not that old anymore, right? And that's it. Like that was stark. Like all the witches of TikTok, all the even younger telemites, they did not join the the in-person parties. I mean, even my students at the college. I mean, it's College of Studies is an older institution, caters to a specific demographic, but again, the average age there was maybe 50, right? And when I used to work at Threadwell's, that was already it is already a decade ago now. But we used to do events every night. Threadwell's, for those of you who don't know, it's one of the 3 main esoteric bookshops here in London. Back in the day,
most magical place in the world.
It is the most magical place in the world. Yes. And I was lucky to be like the manager there, like for almost 5 years. And we used to do like events every night, and there was a very good mix, like old people, and by old people I mean like in their 90s, and literally the Tumblr witches, right? At the time we were called the Tumblr witches, and then it would become like witches of TikTok, like young people in their 16, 17, something like that. They're gone. I don't see them anymore. I don't see them. Like I still go to the bookshops often. They're not around. So
this is maybe I can chime in here from my experience, and I'm not sure if it totally tracks to you both. One of the things that I notice that's different between my younger audience and my older audience is that my older audience actually has money to afford things. They actually have the ability to pay for stuff. Younger people are in much dire financial circumstances than people, a generation above me. And this is part of the reason why when I recently did my Agrippa class, I did not put it behind any form of paywall, because I wanted to make it pretty radically accessible to a younger generation. Because I had a lot of, for instance, I'll say older, for instance, Freemasonry. A lot of older Freemason folks and Rosicrucian folks who were very interested and were willing to happily throw money at it. But I was not seeing that coming from younger generations because they just don't have it. And so it was and so one of the things I'm thinking about trying to do, and I'm not sure I'm going to do it, is trying to develop some kind of like a fund or a scholarship specifically aimed at younger scholars. And I have a couple of younger scholars who are coming on this trip that I'm doing with Egypt, in Egypt, and really want to build them up. And so I wonder if this is also an issue just of finances. It's not, it's a generational issue, but it's also a financial issue of taking a train from, wherever to pay admission to this, to buy a book. And all of a sudden you're looking at 200 pounds to get into London. That's a several days wages for some young people. Maybe a retiree with a decent pension, it's something they're able to throw a little bit more money at. I don't know. That's something that I've noticed demographically in my experience.
No, absolutely, and again, it speaks volume how terrible the world is right now, right? Because I mean, in the span of 10 years, we just cannot afford what we were able to afford a mere decade ago. So yeah, fun times.
I think that's also why witchcraft broadly is such an increasingly flexible and diverse space, is because witchcraft, I think, creates a lot of room for financial diversity, right? As many witches will tell you, it doesn't cost money to practice witchcraft. That's debatable, depending on what we mean by that. It costs money just to be alive. But
you don't need a lion's belt.
You don't need like a solid gold hat or whatever Marco has. I don't know.
I literally looked at my altar over there. I was like, no, yep, it's there.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, you look at something like Enochian magic, and you do it by the
Yeah.
letter, man, you're spending $15,000 on stuff.
Witchcraft, it's like, I
Uh,
found this in my yard.
Yeah. So yeah, it is, again, this is the interesting difference of, practicing something that was developed by a 16th century aristocrat versus a tradition
mm-mm.
coming, at least in some sense, from a cunning tradition.
Yeah.
That's a quite a, quite a yeah, there's a substantial difference in finances. But yeah, this is the thing I'm thinking about, is what does a scholarship look like where older generations of people interested in this material can begin the process of investing in younger generations, literally to enable them to attend conferences and bloats or whatever it would be. I just feel like this is a way that generational wealth can turn into the maintenance.
Yeah.
Like, that we have this thing in Judaism where we talk about, like, look, like, if you talk about the importance of the generational exchange of Judaism, if you're not putting your money where your mouth is in terms of making sure that you do that, then no person in their right mind is going to spend $500 to go to a conference to listen to some, guy talk about Solomonic magic or whatever.
Yeah, I get it.
So
Well, and I think even before we're talking about finances, at least in witchcraft communities, but I'm sure in yours as well, one of the first things that we can do is not being dismissive of young people.
Sure.
Mhm.
Like I said, I'm ambivalent about the internet, but I definitely see this tendency that, like, when it's a 20-something woman on TikTok, we automatically think it's stupid. And what if we didn't do that? I'm not saying there's not stupid stuff, right? But I know when people on my own YouTube channel, when people want to insult me or dismiss me, they call me a girl, right?
Mm.
Like, they think I'm young, right? Somebody doesn't like something I said, and it's like, oh, well, when she's older. I'm in my 40s, y'all. Like, when am I old enough to be respectable? I don't know. But we still think that youth is bad, youth is stupid, especially when it's female or female coded. So even just like questioning, interrogating those impulses is helpful, even if you can't finance the youth.
I think that's totally. I think that that's an excellent point. That, no one needs to look like me in order to be wise or a good practitioner or smart or learned.
It might just be updating your reading lists. I tell that to
Yeah.
coven leaders all the time. When was the last time you updated your reading list for seekers?
I mean, that's
Sure.
a big problem with the AA, right? That we're still like the syllabus like laid out by Crowley 100 and something years ago, and feels like, hey, yeah, but maybe we have even better translations of the same text right
Yeah.
now.
Well, no, if you're not reading Ellis de la Vie in French, you're not. That's not. Yeah.
Right. Why would you even do that? Yeah.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Something I found worth saying, because I think that, I mean, so of course you guys know, but maybe people looking at us, like I had spats online with younger female coded people in the last 5 years or so. But I would also say that, okay, is it okay though to criticize younger practitioners when they go out of line? Like, if it's when I say out of line, I'm not saying like, hey, they have a different perspective than me on what the third chapter of the Book of the Law says. But for instance, if they start hanging out with questionable characters, if they start like if you notice that their following is mostly made by questionable politics, like, is it okay to call them out? Or because for instance, me or people like me, we are like a middle-aged man, we cannot do it, because if not, it becomes unacceptable, and then it becomes like we poison the well. Where do we draw the line?
Well, I think that's one of those scenarios where, on the one, everybody is subject to criticism. Everybody's subject to criticism, and that's a thing that happens just by virtue of being in the public eye. And I think we all saw that. And like, there was definitely a conversation that needed to be had. But it's also true that men get on the internet and say terrible things to women and femme presenting folks all the time. And I think, as difficult as a line as that might be to walk for someone like you, we also don't really feel bad for you. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah, I do.
So, yeah, and I think those are conversations that I think are also sometimes better addressed. Yeah, they happen in public, but we also have to bring them back to our own communities, right? Like, when we see, and it's happening now, right? Politically, of course, we're living in this climate where there's a lot to be critiqued, and I think people are they're calling each other out and they're reevaluating, who am I following? Am I putting my money in accordance with my values? And we have to be having those conversations in our immediate communities too. There's a lot of people who are happy to call out an influencer on X or whatever, but they won't have a conversation with their coven mate.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, it's a mess, but nobody
this is
feels
the
bad for the men.
And this is a big difficulty of just navigating these Wild West spaces where no one really, people often, I get people come to me and ask me, well, how can I become a successful academic YouTuber? And I'm like, I have no idea, because I shouldn't be one. Like it's an accident. It's at some level, there's some accident here. And so, I think a lot of us are just figuring that out. At least I feel like I am. I don't feel like I ever know what I'm doing. And also, the question of mentoring. How does one reach through generations in a very intentional way? And both in academia and also from my understanding in the world of the occult, mentoring can look like grooming, and it functions in many cases. And I'm thinking from academia here, it can turn into, I think, very toxic kinds of relationships.
Yeah.
But I also wonder about, how do I transmit to generations younger than me? What responsibility do I have to encourage them to go into academia knowing that the job market doesn't exist? Like, these are questions that are knowing that there are toxic environments in which they'll be entering into, and and also, but how do I not stamp the fire out of a very bright 18-year-old who really wants to go get a master's degree in Western esotericism in Amsterdam? It's not for me to snuff that fire out. But what's the real talk to be had in terms of the mentoring relationships that we can develop?
I mean, I don't know if maybe it's because I'm living in a bubble, but I think that somehow we managed to navigate those tumultuous waters. Like, I don't see much drama anymore. Possibly because I don't know. I removed myself from it, but I don't know. Is there still do these things still happen, or are we able to discuss more on a level playing field now on the internet? I don't know. I really don't know. Like, I haven't noticed any change. I mean, or rather, I noticed a positive change.
I will say this, speaking as somebody who teaches, I taught high school, and then I'm teaching at a university now, and I absolutely have students in my inbox who oh, what I do is cool, and can they do it? And oh my gosh, you can get a degree in that. And yeah, there's definitely a line to walk between wanting to encourage dreams and also wanting to be realistic. And the thing that I have learned is that it's better to be direct and honest, and that's not necessarily the same as being doom and gloom. You have to trust young people to be creative in the same way that I was creative, because I had wonderful mentors as an undergrad who were dire about, the job market has been terrible as long as people have been talking about a job market, and it's particularly bad right now. But there's never been a scenario where people were just like, yes, go get a PhD and talk about witchcraft. That's a great idea. Right? Like, when you take intro to critical theory or whatever, you don't read William James's SPR stuff. You just focus on the mainstream thing. Like, it's never been palatable for us to tell youngsters, absolutely, go to Exeter, go to Amsterdam. But we have to give young people, and I think people who have that drive, the opportunity to be creative. Maybe the objective isn't to get a conventional job. Maybe this is going to be the person who hits it big on YouTube or figures something out that we didn't have. I mean, you have to tell people up front. I tell people what my experience has been like. I tell people what it's like to teach. I'll tell people up front what kind of money I make, and then give that person the credit to make the choice.
Yeah.
And to your point earlier, Thorn, that you're kind of white knuckling it, right? You're just like, look, I'm going to do what I want to do, and
we're all going to die, guys.
Yeah, come hell or high water. So that's the way to do it. Just white knuckle the degree, and just like, this is what's going to happen. Is going to happen.
Right.
Let's get to now. I want to get your sort of bird's eye view on where is the culture now. What are sort of what are some of the salient features of a culture as you see them now in your respective communities, in your respective online spaces? I'll say for me that one of the things I'm definitely noticing is a huge demand to go in person. This Egypt man, I'm doing 2 back-to-back tours in Egypt
Go
that
to
are
Egypt.
not, yeah, it's a wild place, and I'm getting, it's like in my inbox is full of like, come here and do this talk, and come to this weekend seminar, and come do this. There seems to be a huge demand, although not a huge interest in paying anybody to do it, of course, but a huge
Exactly.
demand in sort of immersive, in-person, often on location uh, learning. I'll say I can only speak to the learning aspect of it. That's one thing that I've noticed has hugely upticked, even in the past year. But I'm curious, from your perspectives, what are you noticing are sort of the big salient features of a culture um, right now? Even Nosferatu, I think, had a has had a uptick in interest. Not a huge uptick, but I've been tracing it and seeing, Eggers and Nosferatu sort of pop, and like, oh yeah, people are now like, ooh, sigils. It's a thing.
I mean,
So
the,
again, these are just small little things I'm noticing, but I'm curious again, for your more expert opinion.
I mean, in my experience, is exactly as you just outlined. There's a lot of interest in person experiences, retreats, like going to places. I've done one in France in September, and I'm gonna do another one. It's been rescheduled now. It's gonna be in October in Joshua Tree with Peter Levenda. We're gonna do well. We're gonna actually look at the same thing you're looking at. Celestial Scent, Merkava mysticism, but from a occult perspective. Like Peter wrote this book called Stairway to Heaven, 2008, and we're gonna bring in even the Necronomicon because we're gonna go weird with that. But there's a huge interest in that. Like let's go places and let's have
I want to go
adventures.
on a retreat.
Come,
I need a
come to.
retreat. Nobody ever wants to retreat with me.
Well, put it
Just
up.
continue.
Put it up.
I don't like organizing things. So
But that's the thing. I don't either. So I found somebody who does the logistics, and I just show up and pretend that I know what I'm talking about. Which is, but yeah, I mean that's the same. Another thing I noticed is that I don't know. Maybe I'm gonna attract the ires of many people now. I think that the occult book bubble is bursting. Like
oh
at least
yeah.
at least in my world, there's less
Oh
and less
yeah.
interest in let's buy this human skin bound edition of a book that came out 3 years ago, which is maybe it's a good thing, right? Because it was a bit of a silly silly bubble, sorry. That's it. I mean, that's as simple as it is. Like back to in-person experiences. And what about you, Thorn?
I see continuations of things that I'd remarked on earlier. One of the things that I see in witchcraft communities, which I think is also related to this kind of individualism that I was talking about, is I think witches collectively are less invested in associating with tradition. Hang on, let me put some scare quotes around that. What I mean is like established tradition, or we're less interested in identifying in a way that makes us legible to somebody else. I
Okay.
don't see people who are deeply invested in becoming Alexandrians, right? Or becoming eclectic Wiccans. It's right. Like we come up with monikers for ourselves now, right? I am an Irish folk witch, chaos witch, who, right? Like we come up with very specific, highly individualized ways of describing ourselves, and I think that a lot of that is that deep desire to connect with something very personal and intangible, right? Like there's this desire to not be a part of a wider crowd, and there's lots of ways that we could dissect that. Some of it I think is branding and capitalism and markets, right? There's a market. If you call yourself a green witch, suddenly there's products to buy. But I also think that it's rooted in really helpful impulses related to things like um, decolonization, right? Like this emphasis on getting away from appropriation, right? Or people are learning more about kind of the problematic politics of some movements, et cetera, and they're pulling away. And I think that kind of inquiry should be encouraged. It goes in a lot of different directions, but people are suspicious in the same way that people are suspicious of like mainline Christianity, right? And they're doing more individualized things. They're also suspicious of the traditions that have been around for decades, and they want to go forge their own path. And I'm still seeing a lot of that. Yeah,
I think
that's
that's
a big thing.
I mean, I think that's great, to be fair, because I mean, if there was one good takeaway of the whole pandemic experience, was exactly this, right? Like find who you are, find your own individuality,
Mhm.
and craft your own practice. Now, one thing I would say, just a corollary to that, is that again in Telema, as I was saying at the beginning, there is this kind of strange dichotomy because again, Aleister Crowley is such a huge brand that no one will ever top. People, at least at the beginning, they want to be OTO members because like this is going to give me the Aleister Crowley badge.
Sure.
That
Access.
I've seen that, right? But then again, like people still will study with me, and I am like the heretic, like that. Like I'm the the OTO enemy. So maybe there's hope, right? That there will be more individuation, more more search for individualism also in Telema. We should ask Aaron Leach what he's thinking about what's happening in in Golden Dome sites, in Golden Zone areas, but
Right.
I don't
Or
know
at
about
least
that.
at least a more critical approach to membership. Because
Yeah,
I don't see a downtick in seekers. I'm not like no longer getting inquiries about my coven, but I'm getting smarter inquiries. I'm getting
yeah,
inquiries from people who they've explored other things or they've really thought about what they want in a way that maybe I wasn't 10 years ago.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that at least from the esoterica side of things, and I can say a little bit about from the Judaism side of things, is there's been a desire of sort of like this very Renaissance, like let's go back to the sources, let's go back to tradition, let's
Mm.
go back
Mhm.
to, that's a very, and but it's interesting about that is that one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a desire to that let's go back to stuff and let's and I don't mean like trad and like the sort of reactionary sense of that, but sort of like an embrace of a kind of traditionalism, which I'm very sympathetic to in many ways. um, but it's a traditionalism that's very individualistic, and
Mhm.
in my opinion, and in my religious opinion, but also in my experience, those two things often don't play well together.
Hmm.
That tradition and community tend to
Sure.
be very, very strongly connected in a way that many people want to have the strengths of tradition and the buttressing of tradition.
But
They
without
don't want
it.
to have to do any of the messy work of having to like,
Hmm.
negotiate people, because like starts
Yeah.
at hell as others. Um, and I find that for me, what's most important for me religiously is often community. Community is sort of the
Mhm.
core around which the religion an accretion in some ways. Um, but I wonder if you've noticed that as well, a kind of desire for historical authenticity. And Esoterica really feeds into that for better and for worse. People are like, oh, now I have the first printing of whatever. Not that that makes spirituality any more or less true or
Sure.
real, in my opinion. But also that desire to go back to a kind of traditional buttressing, but devoid of
Hmm.
the more communal aspect. I know I find that worrying to some degree, because I feel like one of the many complaints that I hear, and one of the righteous complaints I hear, is people feel deeply atomized, deeply alone, deeply lonely, and yet there's a resistance to that admittedly messy building, um, around community. But I wonder if you guys are experiencing something like that as well.
Sure, I can speak. The big trend in witchcraft communities right now is the idea of folk witchcraft. And I can't tell you exactly when that term was coined, but it's definitely come to the fore in witchcraft publishing in the last handful of years. We've watched very prominent voices on social media shift their identities and start using the word folk. And it means something really broad, right? It means something different in like the folklore classes that my university offers versus what it means amongst witchcraft practitioners on TikTok or Instagram, et cetera. And you're seeing more people I think you're right. It's that same impulse. If we go to the past, there's this. First of all, there's that kind of perennial value placed on things that are old are better. But there's also, I think, that really admirable desire to get in touch with oneself, right? Well, if you're interested in practicing magic, it makes sense to take a look at your ancestry to a point. Absolutely. But the things that get lost in that are, like here in the United States, for example, one of the things that I document as a researcher is how I don't think people realize how influential things like spiritualism were. So sometimes when we're looking at your great grandma's folk practice, it's still spiritualism, right, or theosophy a lot of the time. So sometimes we're digging into these folk practices, which are still folk, right? Folk doesn't necessarily mean ancient, right, or capital T traditional. It's what's circulating amongst the people in any given moment. But we've branded it in such a way that it makes it difficult for people to chase, I think. And that can lead to the sort of loneliness that you're talking about, absolutely. And the kind of contrariness when it comes to being in community.
Which is, I think, that contrariness is something that I embody very strongly. I spoke about, because the problem with me and Telema is that Telemic communities are essentially broken, right? In the sense that they function as satellites to a system, the OTO, that it's just not working, right? It's just, there's no way it's working. It's rotten to the core. And so my criticism towards Telemic community, the concept of Telemic community, is that we almost need like to clear out all the rubble and start again. But in order to do so, we have to build up ourselves first, right? I mean, this is something that Telema is about. Telema is strongly individualistic. The idea that you're a star in company of other stars, but you have to become a star first. You have to realize your stardom, okay? That sounds a bit weird. But the point, I think the point is translating well. So I've been heavy critic of the concept of community, but not because it doesn't work. We need communities, of course. We need. I mean, like even here, we are doing this discussion because we're all part of this culture, right? However, when it comes to my specific side of a culture, I think that Telemites will need to clear the house first and start from scratch and leave behind ideas of strictly hierarchical system, even even what Crowley envisioned, like starting like exactly what Crowley envisioned, and rethink community again. But you can only do that if you build up yourself first. And I think Dilemma is going to have a lot of soul searching. I mean, it is a very young system, 121 years this year, actually almost. So it's we are the Christians in the caves, not even, right? So for us, there's a long journey ahead. But before we can actually truly, I think, embody the good side of community, we will have to rethink its structure.
Unlike Wiccan community, we're perfect.
I mean, I know
ancient, not 120 years. Yeah, the oldest
ancient.
religion in the world.
Exactly, right? Margaret Murray said that.
Yeah.
I know. No,
you know?
definitely seconding that, and that's just a tangent, right, to toss out too, is I think one of the consequences of the pandemic and the emphasis on the internet and everybody being online is it's a lot easier to see our sore points, right? It's a lot easier to see bad behavior. It's a lot easier to see the problems. And I become increasingly anti-hierarchical the older I get, which makes negotiating my position as a Gardnerian high priestess real weird sometimes. And I approach it as an adventure, and a healthy one, I think. But everybody being online and everybody talking and everybody being in these kinds of new forms of community also means that we can go, hey, this guy sucks, and now everybody knows it, or oh, we discovered this thing about this pagan famous person, and now we've got to deal with it. I mean, I think everybody's in for a reckoning, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just y'all.
At least that. Yes.
Yes, we're all suffering. Great.
All right, looking 3 to 5 years out, and obviously 3 to 5 years out, this is sort of within the confines of the current administration we're in here in the United States, and maybe just a little further out. What do you see the trends? Where do you see things going? What are sort of your predictions? And as occult practitioners and people who have the ability to practice divination, unlike me, I'm going to hold you to these, and if they're wrong, then I expect to be compensated in full. So, but divination aside, what trajectory do you see things? Where do you see things going?
I don't know if I'm confident calling this a trajectory, but I'm. So this is something that's on my brain. I'm wondering what it's going to look like. Marco mentioned earlier, kind of the bursting of the occult publishing bubble, and I'm definitely feeling that too. I'm seeing it in book sales. I'm just seeing it amongst my friends, right? Back channel with my author friends. I feel like we're seeing less emphasis on printed text. And on the one hand, I think it's a good thing that we have other media. I think that it's beneficial to have video and short form video. I think all of that stuff is great. But I don't know what the future looks like when the emphasis isn't on books, just because books have been so central in occult spaces as a whole for so long. This kind of magical association with written text that we've seen for years and years and years. Parts of it are worrying, right? I do think that there's definitely that string of anti-intellectualism that goes along with a mistrust of books. On the other hand, I also see a shifting in how we produce books. We're seeing the return of zines, right? And we're seeing more self-publishing. And I think that stuff is awesome. I'm hopeful that we'll see a return of blogs with people getting off of meta platforms, right? TikTok not being as viable an option, maybe an option at all. But yeah, I'm wondering what the book situation is going to look like in a few years.
Likewise, I think it's really hard to look in the future, because I think we are in a very strange juncture with tech, in the sense that, I mean, we haven't discussed it so far, but the monster, not even the elephant, the monster in the room is AI, right? Well, AI in the sense LLMs, large language models, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Thorn was mentioning like how the book creating business is changing, like literally. Those systems can, I don't want to say they can write books yet. Of course they can't, and maybe they never will be able to, but they're both stealing the job and empowering a new generation of, to actually become authors, right? But will there ever be like a crowd to sell these books to in a few years time? Because maybe, like I said, I really think that we are in this quantum leap whereby maybe in 5 years time, social media won't exist anymore. And remember that social media only existed for 15 years. We take it for granted now, but back in 2008, when YouTube started to become a thing, Facebook started to become a thing. I mean, remember when I started like looking at this, find a profile, create a profile, watch things. I mean, it's only 15 years ago, 16 years now, something like that. But things have been, exponentially accelerating, and I think we will see more of this exponential acceleration to the point that maybe it's time we should start saving these videos on YouTube, because maybe there won't be YouTube in 3 years time, right? It's crazy to think right now, but I don't know, could be.
I don't think that's crazy at all. I don't think, because we basically just lost TikTok, and people are leaving Instagram in droves. People are leaving I think that we could be looking at a space where social media maybe at least isn't what it was.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And that, I do think that in that sense, we will, like Thorn was saying, we will get back to the blog. Like I went back to the blog. I started a year ago, I started a Substack. Of course, it's not a real blog because I'm still depending on a platform, but I need that platform because, Substack brings branding. Again, like the leitmotif of this conversation, right? But overall, that's been a great endeavor for me, because I got, over 1,000 subscribers in a year, starting from zero. People are super engaged, way more than Instagram, which is my next big thing. I've never been constant on YouTube, but for a while, I was doing live streams on YouTube anyway. But anyway, Substack, blog, written word, it's it's great. It's back in business in many ways, right? Maybe if even Substack falls apart, people would just go back to an atomized internet where little realities will happen, right? But then again, maybe the way those atomized reality will be connected will be completely different, because I do think that if the trajectory we're on continues, what we call AI will change drastically the way we interact with each other and with the world. I mean, it could, from a spiritual perspective, we could finally get to virtual reality, haptic virtual reality, like real, like where you go in a space and you touch other people, you smell other people, or smell incense or whatever, right? I remember in the 90s, somebody put together a virtual Golden Dawn temple, and for the time it was like incredible, right? I think we're getting to the point where we could actually do it. And of course, then we have to ask ourselves, is a virtual reality ceremony is real? Is it real or is it not? Like, where does the experience happen? Like, in many ways, we're going back, like, is this something that happens in the soul? Is there a soul, or is it something that happens in our sensory sphere? So then maybe, yes, and haptic virtual reality could completely give the same even better experiences. Because if you think about it, if you want to have a proper, not even Golden Dawn, if you have a proper OTO initiation, you have to have a very nice temple, and most people cannot afford a very nice temple, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that it's very hard to figure out what we will be, because I think we will see the world will change so fast and will keep on changing.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. I would say books wise, but what I really mean is content wise. And I'll ask this to you as someone as a content creator, but also as someone who's also interested in venturing into publishing. Dana Trell and I recently did this work on Agrippa, and I work in both the antiquarian book world, but also in knee deep in the academic publishing world for worse. But I'm curious what kind of content, if there's been a collapse in occult publishing in some ways, and maybe to some degree that's cleaned the glut of maybe a lot of stuff that didn't need to exist. I'm curious, what would you both want to see coming out in the next 3 to 5 years? And I know that everyone always says, at least in sort of the occulty world that I watch as much as I do, it's people always say advanced stuff, intermediate stuff.
Kill me.
And so I know it's not that. I knew it wouldn't be that. But what I am curious is, what do you want to see? And I say that as a content creator who wants to be someone who's self-conscious of practitioners, and I want to be someone who's able to make content for practitioners that is worth their while, all the while maintaining whatever academic-y, scholarly stuff I need to maintain on my end. But I'm curious, both from from that side of things, but also in general, what do you both want to see?
I am dying, and I think this speaks to some of the points we've raised earlier about community. I'm dying for personhood. I want memoir. I'm tired of people putting themselves on a pedestal as teachers, right? Like, if you dig hard enough, there's a book on the stuff. The idea that there aren't advanced books, to me, is asinine, right? Like, maybe there aren't any that are easily accessible, or maybe they aren't affordable, or maybe they're not interesting, or maybe they're not in the right language, right? Like, there's all kinds of barriers to those texts. It's true, but they're there. To me, the thing that isn't there often is the humanity of the people actually doing magic. The thing that I loved about the early days of YouTube is how people just turned on their camera and talked about their lives. That is the only occult content that I consume. I want to see real people talking about themselves. I want to know about the dramas of their coven and how they're resolving it. I want to know what book they just read that they thought was so cool, or like this little synchronicity that happened at the open ritual. That, to me, is the stuff that really humanizes the craft, especially in occultism, I think, really broadly. And we're so dismissive of that because we're just so ready for everybody to be a teacher, and it's exhausting.
Interesting that you go there, because I am on the polar opposite of that.
That's why we're both here, Marco.
Exactly. So what I first of all, I agree with both of you when you say that everybody says like they want They want an advanced stuff or intermediate stuff. That's the criticism I've been piled on, because, oh, did we really need yet another Crowley primer? Apparently we did, because the book sold very well. And honestly, it's because, it's just about like finding a new voice that is more maybe more in time, more with a zeitgeist, right? The next book that I'm writing, when it's being edited right now, it's quite advanced, right? It's about it's mysticism, it's the Holy Guardian Angel. But there's a chapter in there where I literally wrote that I tried my best not to speak about my experience, because I don't want my experience to color the experience of others. So since this is such a the experience of the Holy Guardian Angel in Thelema in particular, which is, as we discussed with Arnold Nietzsche some months ago, it's very different the way we see it in Thelema, the way it's in the Abramelin itself, right? In Thelema is samadhi in a way, so it's identification with the divine. The problem is that, like, every time I had this discussion with my students or in general, everybody was asking me, what did you do so I can do the same? But that's not how it works, because if you try to emulate me, you will not get anywhere, right? So while I understand and maybe I would love to see more memoirs, but they should really be framed in the sense that, like, really, I don't know, maybe like novels or something like that, whereby if it still has to be an essay, or still has to be an how-to text, I would love to see a different way to convey information. Something that worked for me very well, for instance, to use a lot of diagrams, like literally like put a lot of figures in it, which sometimes maybe it feels like anti-intellectual, but hey, if you have to learn how to do the LBRP, the lesser ritual of the pentagram, and if all you had all your life was like little tiny images done by Crowley in the 1920s, out of sudden you have like maybe 20 pages that go into each stage, people will learn, right? So I don't know, maybe something more technical in a way. But again, this is literally from my tradition, which is heavily technical. Maybe something else, other traditions that don't rely too much on ritualistic practices, maybe they have different approaches. But definitely the idea that, like, in my experience, at least, maybe this is only that happens in Thelema, every time somebody speaks about their experience of the Holy Guardian Angel, or their experience with crossing the abyss and these big milestones of initiation, people want to learn that so that they can emulate, they can have a roadmap, which is useful, but it's going to put them as far as possible from having the experience themselves. So
that makes sense. Well, and I think the good news is that we don't have to choose. I think both of us are railing against, I think, this mold that everybody has been, because I'm with you on the one hand, like, oh, does everything have to be a beginner book? You know what? I still don't have a beginner book to give to people about Wicca. I don't have one.
Really?
I'm not giving them stuff from the 70s and 80s. I'm sorry. So, right?
You should write it then.
That sounds like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
Right. And I've definitely had the experience of trying to learn the LBRP from really books, from like these books you're talking about. So yeah, I'd like to see more diversity in the kinds of content that's available.
Yeah.
This is a thing that's also, as an outsider, that's often I don't know, the right imbalance is maybe the right word, is that when I look, for instance, at Christianity, Judaism, there's been a tradition that's grown up of liturgical literature, of homiletical literature, of mystical literature, of like the Ordo literature of how to do the right, and none of them feel the need to muddy the waters. That is to say, if I pick up a text of Hildegard of Bingen, she's not going to interrupt her visions to tell you how she was served the Eucharist, because she's not concerned with that. This is a mystical autobiography, and I feel like maybe there's a like for instance, I've never seen like occult homiletical literature.
I'm thinking if there's something in the that'd be great.
Maybe a little bit in the Equinox.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
There's a lot of liturgical literature. But to Thorn's point, there's also not a lot of like mystical autobiography that,
I mean, Crowley did write
of
one.
course, right? Because Crowley doesn't like to, he can write about himself till the cows come home. but it's just, I think many people coming into a culture often, I think, don't know the larger history of religious literature, and that there is
Mhm.
a vast
Yes.
plurality of religious literatures, of which they're all speaking in different voices, and they're all part of that landscape. And I feel like there's a desire to have to do everything at once.
Yeah.
And I've often read, I can't think of the exact text now; it's not coming to mind, where they'll be talking about how to do a ritual, and then they'll transition into an anecdote about it, and they'll transition back into how
Yeah.
to do the. And I'm like, okay, I'm not quite sure what's what here, because this literature is
Mhm.
confusing to me, and maybe that's good and maybe it's bad. But at any rate, I
I
love the
mean,
idea of an expanding of what is constitutive of the literature of a
mhm.
culture.
Yes.
That
Yes. Yes. Yes.
that
Yes. Yes.
also is exciting to me.
Yeah, like Thorn would say, we don't need to choose. We can have both.
Mm.
Maybe
I
we
want
should
all of it.
all of it. Exactly.
I think that's a. I mean, that again, as a person from the outside, that's the kind of stuff that I'm
Mhm.
interested in, is a variety of things. Because I could tell you, if I have to read another medieval grimoire about how to summon a spirit to turn invisible, I'm like,
If I have to listen to a man on the internet read a medieval grimoire and then talk about it,
How to get
sorry,
invisible, right? Yeah.
the
it's
damn
okay.
algorithm.
You're allowed.
I'm allowed.
You
Oh
can, you
God,
can.
I don't want
Nobody
to.
else.
I don't want to. Like, I'm just like, another one. The treasure ones are always fun for me, but man, like, and here's 30 ways of making a woman fall in love with you. I'm like, oh great, more medieval.
Try washing your face. It's really
Yeah.
not that hard,
Talk to them. Like,
right?
if you find yourself using demons to get yourself a girlfriend, you've needed to ask questions
You
about your
yeah.
life decisions.
And then
Medieval
again,
and modern dudes.
and then again, if you go to Reddit, you'll find a lot of that discourse
Yeah,
going on. So
it's
it's been
there. It's
forever going on, right?
yeah, it's been. We are never not in the Middle Ages. What are you guys
Exactly.
hopeful about? What do you guys? A culture is. It's easy to be, doom and gloom about things, and I think that we're living. I'll say for me, like, I'm living in one of the best periods I could to be doing the work I'm doing. I have more access to digital scans of medieval manuscripts in a way that no one has had access to in the past. I can do so much work that would be totally impossible, and as much as the internet is crap and all that stuff, I'm also, that stuff makes me feel very empowered and very hopeful
Mhm.
about what I can do as a scholar, but also what up and coming scholars who are far more savvy with the internet are able to do. And I'm curious, for y'all more veteran practitioner folks, what makes you hopeful and what makes you worried, but not what makes you worried, because you will spend 3 hours about
Sure,
that.
I was doing that.
Um,
Exactly.
Not worried. Not worried.
not worried, hopeful. Let's do hopeful.
Let's just
I'm
focus on hope.
yeah.
I'll say
I'm
a
all
couple of
dressed in.
things. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marco. I've been
No, I
talking a
was just
lot.
saying that I'm all dressed in black. So asking me to be hopeful, it's tricky. We'll try. We'll try. Thorn, please.
Um, I've got a couple of things. First of all, I will say, and I pointed at this earlier. I have a lot of faith in the young people who are moving in magical spaces right now, especially witchcraft spaces. Um, I know that, we talk shit about witch talk, right? And social media and influencer culture, and all that stuff has its problems, but I really think that the good is something that we don't talk enough about. I'm excited that young people come into witchcraft and they want to do revolutionary things. I'm excited that people are pumped to try new things and forge away maybe from more established systems. I think that's great. I'm excited about more voices. I'm excited about more marginalized voices. I think all of that is really great. As an academic, I'm pumped by the number of opportunities that I have. I think we were talking a little bit about naysaying, especially in academic spaces. I really had been under the impression for a long time that I was gonna have to white knuckle it if I wanted to be the weirdo, right? If I wanted to talk about contemporary witchcraft or the paranormal or whatever, then I wasn't gonna have any hope, and that hasn't been true at all. I have found funding, I have found opportunities, I get into conferences regularly, people are pumped about my topic, and maybe I won't get a tenure track job at, like, a fancy private school, but I don't care because God bless the internet. Right? There's actually a lot of opportunity, I think, for creative, smart people.
And like I agree with you in the sense that I've been doing this job like with teaching and
Mhm.
writing about magic and dilemma. It's incredible. Like I never thought that would would be even possible, right? And speaking about opportunities, yes, the internet is still a great spotlight for people like us. In a few weeks, if you have Discovery Channel, you'll see me on TV because I've been invited to do something for Expedition X, which is a paranormal show. This summer, they flew me to France.
Oh my gosh.
It was great. It was
That's
fantastic,
awesome.
right? And like it's crazy, but it worked, right? And I think that I'm hopeful about the fact that despite everything we discuss, the ups and downs, the problem maybe with branding is still a big thing, capitalism and whatnot. I do think that right now we have a generation, not just younger and not so young people. I mean, everybody who's interested in the occult right now, the quality is so much higher because like people have engaged with it properly, right? They have access to good resources. Again, Esoterica is possible. I mean, we can say it's the biggest, right? And it's the most accessible. And but even that, right? Even smaller communities, smaller channels, smaller realities. I mean, the quality got better. Like we went through these up and downs, but hey, like in general, you have a lot of great stuff out there. And if you want to hear about Telema, well, you can learn about Telema in the positive way. If you want to learn about witchcraft, you can do it, right? Like there's so much less noise and so much more signal, which is kind of strange because we did spend a good almost 2 hours discussing all the problems we had to come to get here. But hey, like I think it's a net positive, right? We'll see if the landscape changes drastically. But so far, hey, it's a nice place to be.
I agree.
What's going to be your North Star for the next 3 to 5 years? What are you using as sort of like your, this is the thing I want to focus on. This is the agenda, the goal, the principle, the 5-year plan.
For me, like for me, will be continue writing. Like the written form is definitely what I think I do the best. And it's for me like my goal is always to try and democratize dilemma in the sense that like giving everybody who's interested in this magical philosophy the ability to engage with it without having to to sign up to join the established realities. So of course I'm talking about the OTO. There is an alternative, and it doesn't have to be through me. There's just like me and other people. We're like just like as long as we can actually make the text accessible, and that's great. That's what I want to do. Like so, more writing, possibly more books. In fact, I mean, I do have a third book in somewhere here. I have to bring it down now, and in general, like keep on making Telema accessible.
I have two. The big one, this is a professional goal as well as a personal one. I'm deeply invested again with accessibility. For me, it's about bridging practitioner spaces and academic spaces. That was the whole drive, other than my own just like selfish desire to have fun. The whole reason to go back and do the PhD thing and get the letters after my name was because I wanted to be able to walk in academic spaces, because even in academic spaces, right, like we're deeply suspicious, particularly of like religious people, especially people who are part of like weirdo religion. Like I'm still the freak, even though everybody is sort of doing their thing under the banner of secularism, right? Cough, cough. And being able to walk in those spaces and be like, oh, actually, like she's kind of smart. I think there's still this resistance there. And likewise, I wanted to be able to walk in practitioner spaces and maybe bridge some of that material and make it accessible. Like given the cost of academic books and the inaccessibility of the language of academic books, we can still talk about those ideas. I've really tried to shift the focus of the workshops I give at conferences, or the tone of the books that are, if you read Witches Among Us, the tone is real different from Witch's Path or some of my earlier books, and it's because I'm very consciously trying to do a thing.
Okay.
And then on a private level, I want to focus on my coven. I think there's been so much emphasis on the outward, the big community, that there's a tendency maybe to neglect our smaller, intimate spaces. I've got a lot of work I want to do as a high priestess. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time to chat, to hang out, to give your perspectives. Again, it's a perspective I don't have access to, and so it's always a pleasure and an honor to get perspectives from practitioners, which is, again, I think that academics really take for granted that they have access to practitioners. I think that is historically, I think they treat them as a thing to be mined for data, which I find to be deeply disturbing, and the way that the academics look down their nose at historical occult practitioners, I think carries over, frankly, into a modern bigotry against practitioners,
absolutely.
which I find repulsive as a person who comes from a religious minority myself. And this whole, So at any rate, I really want to express my gratitude and my appreciation for that. And I always hope that Esoterica is a welcoming platform for practitioners and practitioner perspectives. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for creating the space.
Absolutely, thank you. I mean, I've been here. I've been your guest quite a number of times now. So it's always great to come back here. It's a very nice place to be. So thank you so much.
Appreciate that. Well, Marco and Thorn, where can folks find you again? I want to make sure that we talk about building community. We talk about supporting your local practitioner, your local occultist. Where can folks find you? Where can folks support you?
You can find me at thornthewitch.com. I've got a YouTube channel. I'm going to resurrect the blog. But if you search Thorn Mooney, I'll come up. I'm running my mouth all kinds of places.
Yeah, I'm pretty much the same. MarcoVisconti.org is my my website, but look for me, you'll find me, and then one day you don't want me anymore because I'm everywhere.
Well, folks, make sure to check out Thorn and Marco. You can find the links in the description and all the normal places. But again, thank you for sharing your perspectives, and hope to get to hang out again soon.
Yeah, I'm not even paying attention to the list, so you do you.
Okay, yeah, just try to be mindful of people's time and things like that.
This is fun.
Also,
that's great.
I'm glad you like it. I have no idea why I have a spoon. So it's like waving a spoon around.
You got to keep that in the recording.